sitting within from T1 to L2. And they'll send their preganglionic fibers out to talk to their respective postganglionic fibers, right? So craniosacral, thoracolumbar divisions, right? These are the two. So we'll talk a little bit about the craniosacral first, a little bit more about that. And basically, for function, just today, we'll get into a little bit more about what exactly this means. But you want to think the buzzwords are rest and digest, feed and breathe, right? This is normal, quiet, everyday activity when you're not under a lot of stress. You're not working out, you're not running from a lion, you're not like trying to do all sorts of energetic things. You're just chilling, right? So feed, rest and digest, otherwise known as, or also called feed and breathe, right? Because it also be getting you in the mood and everything for those romantic nights, right? So all this is part of your parasympathetic division, cranial nerves and the sacral nerves, right? So for these ones, we talked about 3, 7, 9, 10, right? The preganglionic ones were all in your brainstem for those. So that we had preganglionic neurons sitting in the brainstem, their cell bodies, they sent out their axons, and they go to these ganglia, right? Which were kind of closely located out to their target tissues, as we'll see, right? So they had these long preganglionic fibers reaching almost out to the target, right? And these would be the parasympathetic ganglia, right? Groups of cell bodies outside the central nervous system. Not to be confused with something like your dorsal root ganglia, right? So in the brainstem, you have equivalents of that, right? This is called the kind of cranial nerve ganglia, semilunar ganglia. You don't have to know that, but this will be sensory neurons, right? So that's something different. These are second motor neurons out in these ganglia. So 3, 7, 9, 10, they go out to the ganglia, and then the ganglia go out and reach their targets, right? So that was your cranial division of your craniosacral. And then the sacral division also, here's the hypothalamus that was controlling those, but there's also those, it's going to go further all the way down to the end there in the sacral segment of the spinal cord, right? Visceral motor neurons, and they are going to do some of your intestinal stuff, some lower intestine, kidneys, bladder, the respective reproductive organs, right? That's what they're going to be innervating down over here. Makes sense. All this stuff is up by the head. This stuff is all in the pelvic region, right? And the vagus nerve is doing that, all the stuff in the thoraco-abdominal part, right? But these would be the visceral pathway of your parasympathetic division, craniosacral. The other thing to note, important here, about a difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic is that you have these very long preganglionic fibers. They extend almost out to the target organ because the ganglia, the parasympathetic terminal ganglia, are almost embedded within the organ itself, right? So you have these terminal ganglia, right, close to or within the target tissue itself, right? So this means if you just remember this one fact, you'll know that they must have long preganglionic fibers, and they will have short postganglionic fibers, right? The neurons will be right there. So this will be maybe a little important because these are myelinated, remember, and these are not. The preganglionic are myelinated, these are not. That's just something that may be important. I don't test you on it. I don't really understand it completely, but there you go. That may be a functional difference, right? So the reason I'm going off about this is, you remember this one fact right here, that the terminal ganglia are close to within, and then that by deduction, you're going to remember that there's long preganglionic, short postganglionic. And this is important because the sympathetic will be the opposite, right? We're going to have the opposite situation, as we'll see. So then you'll remember, just from knowing this, not only about this stuff, but about the sympathetic. That would be, this is your oculomotor neuron, oculomotor nerve, coming out from the brainstem, went all out to this ganglion, which was pretty close to the target organ. And what did it do when it was stimulated, right? Because you had this sort of reflex where light was shining your eye, and then your eye constricted, right? Decreasing the amount of light. The other reaction was a dilation of your eye, right? This is, again, involuntary. When you go in dim light, this allows more light to come in. This is controlled by your sympathetic nervous system. And so I said that this was the thoracolumbar region, which means the neurons that controlled it, even though they were controlled themselves by the hypothalamus had to send its axon down into the thoracic region. And then the visceral motor neuron would come out and talk to a postsynaptic neuron, which would then go out, and it's got to go up, back up into the head and into the eyeball right there to do this action right here. So it had to go all the way down here and back up here, because this is a sympathetic innervation and all the sympathetic neurons are down here. Right? So this fact that this eyeball, this sort of constriction and dilation of your pupil, right, is innervated by both your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system. You know, this is what's known as dual innervation, which will be the case for, in fact, most of your autonomic innervation, right? You'll have a parasympathetic component and a sympathetic component to cause sort of opposite reactions, as we'll see. The main ones this is going to be applied to is we're going to talk about all the viscera, right? So your vagus nerve hung down over here, innervated a lot of the viscera down over here, but that was also going to be dual innervated by your sympathetic nervous system. And in that case, those secondary neurons are going to be coming from, in part, by these sympathetic chain ganglia running down the side of the spinal cord right here. So for your parasympathetic, again, pre-ganglionic, long pre-ganglionic, going all the way out to the target, short post-ganglionic. Right? For your sympathetic nervous system, even though it's all coming from the hypothalamus brainstem, right? The preganglionic fibers in the spinal cord, they're going to reach out to these sympathetic ganglia that are located very close to the spinal cord. So they're going to have short myelinated preganglionic fibers, and then they're going to extend all the way out to their target, right? Heart, smooth muscle around the blood vessel, organs and stuff like that. They're going to be these long, unmyelinated postganglionic fibers going to the target right here. So that'll be one major difference, like in the length of the pre and postganglion fibers, where the ganglia is. So this is your sympathetic or thoracolumbar division. Functionally speaking, we'll talk a little bit more about this next time, but most active, fight or flight. Right? This is when you need more energy to do stuff in the body, right? So you're going to activate this system that's going to do things like make your heart beat faster, make your lungs get in more air, right? Make your digestion stop, right? All this kind of stuff, which we'll again talk about on Thursday. But fight or flight is the general sort of buzzwords for this. When your body's kind of going a little bit out of the ordinary, right? Parasympathetic, normal homeostasis. This is when either through some kind of external action or your own exertion or something like that, your body's kind of saying it needs to kind of get back in homeostasis or needs to accomplish something. So it's a little bit more of an irregular type of situation. We'll see, though, that there's always a balance of both of them. All right. So this is your thoracolumbar division. And then you have these so-called sympathetic chain ganglia, which are running alongside the vertebrae, in which the preganglionic fibers will come out and connect to the postganglionic fibers in black right here. you also have, besides these sympathetic chain ganglia, these other singular ones that are going to be running in front of the spinal cord in actuality, right here, right? So these preganglionic ones for the sympathetic chain ganglia, they're going to be located somewhere over here, and they're going to send their axons out the ventral root, and they're not going to go out the spinal nerve like a motor neuron. Here, I'll draw a motor neuron down over here. It's going to go out skeletal muscle because that's a somatic motor neuron. The black one here is going to take a different route. It's not going to go out there. Instead, I can tell there's these two ones. One's labeled the white ramus, one's labeled the gray ramus. It's going to go inside this way over here through this white ramus right here. And then maybe sometimes talk to a secondary neuron within here, right? And I know it's the farther one, this white ramus right here, because these are the myelinated axons. All right, so let's look at that a little closer. Right, your sympathetic nerve pathways, right? These myelinated, here's showing two different ones, but we'll just look at one of these right here. This one is going to go out, send its axon through the ventral root, and not go to where that somatic one went. Instead, it's going to travel down that little pathway, the white rami. Right? And then here is where it's going to talk to these postsynaptic cells right here, who are going to then pass the message on through this gray rami. Right? These postganglionic, unmyelinated. That's why they're called gray. That's why these are called white. Right? So they're going to go up through these gray rami, and then they'll return to the spinal nerve and onto their target. So that's that little rami stuff, right? White rami because the myelinated axons from the first one and the unmyelinated axons in the second one. Right, so a little weird pathway right here, but this will be those, it's called here the paravertebral, but this is one of those sympathetic chain ganglia. That's another word for it, paravertebral. Para means alongside, so it's running alongside the vertebral. So these might be the case when these neurons come out to innervate the visceral structures in your skin, right? So there'll be a couple different major, like 3 different kind of major pathways I'll talk about for these sympathetic nerves, right? One of them is the skin, right? So your sweat glands, right? Your smooth muscle controlling your erecti pili muscles, fat cells over here, blood vessels, right? All within your skin, right? They'll kind of take this pathway, right? They'll go in the sympathetic chain ganglia, and they'll be roughly around the area of skin, around that level of spinal cord as close as it can be, kind of like your dermatomes were, right? And then if you read this, right, it'll go through that pathway we just talked about, right? Entering through the white rami, and then the postsynaptic one will leave through that gray rami, and then enter into the spinal nerve to that region right there, right? And if it's, not possible for it to be like, if there was some of the skin above this point, it'll move up and go up a little further into ganglia that are above that area. Okay. So that's your sympathetic innervation to your skin right here, right? So it's a little more complicated than what we saw for your autonomic. You also have a bunch of sympathetic neurons controlling your thoracic cavity structures, right? As well as the ones that we talked about for eyes and glands and stuff of the face. But like your heart, your lungs, and the blood vessels around there, right? These would all go up through that same pathway, through the sympathetic chain ganglia, through those white and gray rami, right? But they'll also have to go upwards, right? Because obviously, the thoracic region is a little bit lower than some of these structures over here. So there'll be these ganglia that are above the thoracic region that they'll extend up to before talking to that postganglionic one, right? So it may ascend, sometimes it may descend, right? But this is the thoracic cavity. So we got your skin, And then we got your thoracic cavities going through these sympathetic chain ganglia running alongside the spinal cord, very close to the spinal cord. We also have another set of ganglia not running directly alongside the spinal cord. And I should mention that these paravertebral runs are on both sides of the spinal cord. You also have ones, 3 or 4, running alongside the anterior surface of the spinal cord, called your prevertebral ones. You'll also see this referred to as collateral ganglia or splanchnic ganglia, right? And these are like 3 or 4 of them that are running alongside the in front of the spinal cord, rather, right? And what these will be doing over here, these are the ones over here, right? These splanchnic nerves, or prevertebral ones, are going to be innervating the abdominal organs over here, because these are usually unpaired. Like a lot of these stuff is paired, right? So it makes sense a little bit more, but a lot of these ones are coming through these prevertebral ganglia, right? So the pathway would be that the preganglionic fiber passes through this sympathetic chain ganglia over here without synapsing. Then it just passes kind of through it and passes on and connects to the ones in the prevertebral ganglion. They'll go on to innervate their target muscles, these guys right here, right? They're referred to as the splanchnic nerves. You'll see these two, where the prevertebral, right in front of the vertebrae. There's not a big major difference between any of this. It's just a little bit of an anatomical difference in these sympathetic ganglia, you'll see, right? So skin, thoracic cavity, and basically your abdominopelvic cavity are going to be, actually your pelvic stuff is a little more like a little closer to your thoracic cavity stuff, but don't get too worried about that. All right. The last one is a singular pathway, and it's unusual because it doesn't have 2 motor neurons like all the other ones. And this is the fact that this one over here, one of these is going to go out and go all the way out into this little party hat on top of your kidney, called the adrenal gland over here. And in particular, it's going to go deep inside the adrenal gland into the adrenal medulla, right? So in this case, there's technically no post-ganglionic neuron ganglionic stuff. The post-ganglionic neurons are actually kind of modified to become these so-called chromaffin cells, right? And what they do, as we'll see, is going to secrete a hormone that postsynaptic neurons usually secrete, but they secrete it right into the bloodstream because of the blood supply here. This is going to be a major kind of effect of the sympathetic nervous system being able to stimulate your adrenal glands, right? All of a sudden you got adrenaline in you. And that's a very big difference, this hormone circulating in your bloodstream, than directly controlling the nerves, directly controlling the organs by like synapses. All right. So this is that pathway, right? Those 4 different pathways. Skin, thoracic cavities through the sympathetic chain ganglia, the splanchnic ones, and the prevertebral ganglia, and then this singular adrenal medulla, right? But this adrenal medulla is so important, right? Because it does this epinephrine, norepinephrine in your blood right here. That's going to be one of the major differences to your sympathetic and your parasympathetic. Your parasympathetic doesn't have any control over this supply right here, right? So your nerves come out, they go all the way into the adrenal medulla, the inside of this gland, and then they go and secrete stuff, release it directly into the blood. Now you have all this adrenaline going into your blood, and like any endocrine system, it's going to go all around your body and find any receptor that has epinephrine or norepinephrine receptors, then activate them, right? So it's going to have widespread effects. And remember, this could stop activating them, but your adrenaline is going to be running around your blood for a lot longer. So long-lasting, widespread effects by this. we'll talk a little bit more. We'll talk about this, epinephrine and stuff more next time. One last thing about why your sympathetic nervous system has more widespread effects than your parasympathetic. Your parasympathetic comes out, it's a discrete release of neurotransmitter onto the postganglionic, and that one has a discrete release onto its target right there, like a single, very few branches coming from this, right? So it's very kind of confined to this pathway. Your sympathetic, on the other hand, will branch off quite a bit, right? So that it's not just getting one cell, it's targeting a whole bunch when this cell goes off right here. And then the postganglionic one will also branch off, right, into this wide sort of area right here. So this is why actually what sympathetic, the name from this actually means is experience, be together, right? Experience together, the whole body-wide mobilization, right? So between the adrenaline and this branching off and like widespread sort of innervation, this is why it's called the sympathetic nervous system, because otherwise it doesn't really make sense why it would be called the sympathetic nervous system. And we'll talk more about all this epinephrine, norepinephrine, stuff like that next time. So what do we got? We got the cranial nerves, your parasympathetic pathway, long vagus nerve going all the way out to the heart. And we'll see that it's going to slow it down, right? Whereas your sympathetic one, the short ganglionic fibers and the paravertebral ganglia, that sends its axon out and does other things to the heart, right? And other things do things like constrict blood vessels and stuff like that. Right? But that's the difference in these, anatomical difference in these pathways. So for that, this is a nice actually summary of everything, right? Your hypothalamus, your master regulator, sending its commands down to the brainstem to control your cranial nerves. And of course, it'll go down to your sacrum region. And then also other regions will also, your red regions over here, we're going to go down to the thoracolumbar region and then control those organs, right? Doing something different for this thoracolumbar region. So that's your parasympathetic and your sympathetic as far as your anatomical differences. Next time we talk about like function, stuff like that, and neurotransmitters and what the difference is and all that might be, and how, you know, other differences in between those besides like the medulla stuff. So the last little thing I want to talk about here is, you know, you'll see the chart in your book like this. You have your autonomic nervous system dividing into your sympathetic and parasympathetic. Then you also have this second one, third one over here called the enteric nervous system. Don't worry, I'm not going to talk too much about this. I just want to explain what it is. Right? Enteric means basically your intestines right over here. And what this means is that your autonomic nervous system and is going to input into this kind of self-sustained enteric nervous system. So both your sympathetic and parasympathetic is going to innervate this. So it's a little kind of confusing, but so here's these nerves, all the blood vessels and lymphatic vessels, nerves, they're coming into your guts, right? Into your digestive system, to GI tract. And they branch off, right? They come in, these would be your sympathetic and parasympathetic extrinsic nerves. They're going to go in, and instead of directly innervating the muscles, they're going to talk to other neurons in here, these enteric nervous system, which can operate independently based on like stretch reflexes and hormones. So it can actually has like operates kind of its own little mini nervous system that could operate independently of your the rest of your nervous system, right? It's even got little interneurons and stuff. Don't worry about it. All you got to know is the ANS, you know, although it can function independently, it's also going to be regulated by the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. In fact, when I talk about, you know, the parasympathetic nervous system increasing activity here by gland secretions and movement here, it's talking to these guys and they're doing it, right? So this is just this whole other kind of system that you got going on. So it's kind of interesting because this is also has like kind of like interneurons and stuff out here outside the brain, which is weird. So that's your enteric nervous system. So next time, so we're almost done here. We're almost done. Next time we're going to talk about, the differences, right? We have the heart innervated by your sympathetic and parasympathetic, right? How is it that the sympathetic comes in and slows down like the sort of normal baseline rate of the heart, or keeps it steady, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is going to speed it up, right? They're both innervating it. How is one going to do one? How is one going to do the other? Right? And this will all kind of relate to everything, all the dual innervated organs, right? You're maybe dilating or constricting the nervous system. You're making things, kind of dry up or decrease secretion, right? Or different types of secretion. And you're increasing or decreasing the heart, right? You're relaxing the airway, bringing more air in, or you're constricting the airway, right? You're stopping the whole digestive tract, or you're increasing the digestive tract. So all these are these dual innervation things. They have opposite effects. And we'll kind of get into how it does that, in those dual innervated, and how the sympathetic, in the cases where there is no dual innervation, how the sympathetic might kind of control levels of activation for that. Right. So there's a table in your book, in Tortoro's book 15.4, if you want to kind of look ahead. This kind of figure, just Google it on the internet. They have all sorts of these. Also, if you want to get ahead of it.